I have to make a confession, and some of you will already know that this is true because you are the ones I am apologizing to. I have been slacking on the listener Q&A stuff, so let me remind you that you can get rid of ads by going to stoicism.supercast.com, link in the show notes for that. And now, without further ado, let's jump right into answering all the backed up Q&A questions, AMA questions, whatever we want to call them, that have been sitting in my Q&A inbox for the last 4 weeks. All right, I can only do this once a month, so I feel like I'm a little late in the month for this, but here we go. Listener Q&A. If you've submitted questions, thank you. If you want to submit a question, you can do so using the link in the show notes of every episode. They're always there. Question number 1. Can you be too young for Stoicism? So the answer is yes. Actually, you can be. It can feel a little bit arbitrary, what I'm maybe about to say in answer to this question, but think of it like this. We already accept that there are certain things that if you're exposed to too young, that is to say if you're too immature, or if your intellectual faculties aren't quite as ramped up yet as they could be as an adult, that exposure to certain things can stunt or damage future growth or understanding of those things, right? We already accept that fairly broadly. There are things you don't expose your 6-year-old to, because if you did, they're just not ready for it. It might damage them in the future. And a rather well-known and studied example of this, at least in men, is the consumption of pornography. Pornography, when viewed by a mature adult who is capable of identifying the fiction, the fictional part of what they're viewing on screen, an adult who can easily separate fantasy from what actually should be expected of a sexual partner in real life, isn't particularly damaging to a person, not to an adult anyway, not to a mature adult. And of course, in adults, there are extreme examples of withdrawal from society and porn addiction, but those are not normative examples or experiences. For the most part, if you're an adult and you're consuming pornography, it's not damaging you. On the other hand, let's imagine the person we're talking about is 9 or 10 years old. This person isn't going to be able to separate fantasy and fiction from what should be expected of a sexual partner. This is going to stunt their ability to develop a healthy view of adult relationships and will probably lead to some pretty unfortunate things that we don't need to go into. Stoicism, obviously, it isn't pornography, but it might be compared to religion in that we don't want to brainwash people with big ideas before they can process big ideas of their own. And I'm not suggesting that religions brainwash people. I'm saying that we all probably have the same reaction to, I'm sure you've seen the video where you've got like 4 and 5-year-old kids speaking in tongues, swearing they've been possessed by demons and shouting to the heavens. I think you've probably seen that video. It's pretty unfortunate. But we don't want to do those things. We don't want to make someone think something. We want them to hear some information, and we want them to be able to come to their own conclusion in a way that they reason themselves to it. And that can probably be, I'm not a parent, but I imagine this is a very difficult thing about parenting, that you know the answer, or you feel as an adult that you know the answer, and you're watching your kid who might be 15, 16, 17, certainly old enough to make their own decisions as far as what they do and don't want to believe. You can see them make stupid decisions or what you feel are stupid decisions because they might have the intellectual faculties and the maturity, but they don't have the experience. The Stoics, if I'm remembering correctly, said that you couldn't be taught Stoicism until you were old enough to wear a toga. That is actually Kai Whiting who informed me of that verbiage right there, old enough to wear a toga. And I've heard other people say it's something like 14, 15, or 16. The ages are relatively arbitrary, I think, but they probably map to some sort of average intellectual, physical development in boys in the ancient world, right? Like most boys by 15 were probably hunting and, helping to keep the household together and supporting for the family. I imagine that's probably true. So it's not that teenagers can't be taught Stoicism. It's that we want people to be intellectually capable of thinking for themselves before we fill their heads with ideas. I will put a link in the show notes to a more academic response and explanation. Look for that if you want to learn more. But essentially, if you're a kid, you're 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-ish, Stoicism probably isn't something that's going to be particularly useful to you. You're not even going to be able to understand or frame it correctly. You're still so much in your formative years. Of course, there are probably exceptions to that. I'm sure they're very smart, very mature people who are only 13, and I've never met those people, but I'm sure, exceptions exist to every rule. But if you're 15, 16, 17, that seems to be more like what the Stoics thought was the appropriate time to introduce this stuff to a young person. Question number 2, I try to focus on what I can control, but it's not easy. My sister has a drug problem, and I'm having a hard time dealing with it emotionally. Any advice? Stoicism isn't an easy philosophy to adhere to. Neither are its tenets easy to put into practice 100% of the time. Try to remember first that you're a prokopton. You're not going to get it right all the time, and you're not going to find it easy. That's not a reason to despair or quit. It's a reason to keep efforting. The longer you effort, the easier it becomes, the more skilled of a prokopton you grow into. As far as your sister with the drug problem, that is tough. I have some experience with addicts, specifically alcoholics and meth addicts, and something I've learned to be true of people in the throes of addiction, at least in these sorts of addictions, is that before any sort of impact can be had, there has to be clarity on the part of the person who's addicted. And clarity doesn't seem to happen until something drastic happens. Like, for example, the Marchman Act, which is, as I understand it, when 3 members of a person's family all agree that law enforcement can take an individual struggling with addiction into custody for up to 72 hours in order that an assessment of their needs might be made. So in order to assess whether or not they need some kind of counseling or help. The result of doing this, of kicking off a Marchman Act, could be a total backfire. I've actually seen it be a total backfire. I've also seen it be a really great success. But if it's a backfire, the person is going to dig further into their addiction. They're going to become less trusting of you. Or it could be that those 72 hours and that assessment gets their head clear enough to realize that they need help and they might voluntarily check into treatment. I've seen that happen as well. Your role in your sister's struggle with drugs can't be to save her, because you can't get someone to do something that they don't want to do. It's my personal opinion as someone who's not a psychiatrist or psychologist or doctor or, person who works in the addiction field or industry, but it's my personal opinion that in order for someone to kick an addiction, 2 things have to happen. They have to get physically free of the drug, which means they have to go through the somewhat ugly process of physical withdrawal, because part of addiction is a physical changing of your brain. And the other thing they have to do is counteract the reason that they turn to drugs in the first place. If someone doesn't like their life, if they feel lost, if they're depressed, if they're sad, if they feel they have nothing to live for, the escapism offered by drugs is probably the thing that pulled them into it in the first place. Again, this is just my opinion, but it seems reasonable to me. So filing a Marchman Act might help her to get clean, but if there's not something in place after she has that moment of clarity in that cleanness, she'll just go right back to it. And there's nothing you can do to give her meaning in her life. That is something that she has to discover on her own. And a Marchman Act might work. It could even become the key to the whole starting of the process of her getting clean and becoming sober. It's something to consider trying if you live. I'm assuming you live within the U.S., because I don't know if the Marchman Act exists outside of the United States, but it's not guaranteed to solve anything. And like I said, it could make it worse. I think the Stoic approach to this is to get together with your family and talk to them without her and ask yourselves what the worst outcome is, then ask how you would feel if the worst outcome happened, and then ask why you would feel that way. And if the answer is because we didn't take action, ask yourself what actions you could take, and if you feel that action might help and you'll regret not trying, then maybe take that action. Also, consider a conversation with her, like an intervention. Perhaps if she sees you all care, she might decide to check into treatment on her own. That happens. It really depends on how serious the drug problem is, because of course there's a spectrum to that. Some people are very casual in their drug problems. They're more like bingers than they are day-to-day users. And some people are so deep into it that they would never check themselves into any kind of treatment. But as far as interventions go, sometimes addicts are just waiting for a sign that people want them to get better. Sometimes they're just looking for love. I know that sounds a little strange, but they're looking for some kind of indication that people actually care that they turn it around. I would also recommend family counseling. And when I say that, I don't mean with her, I mean with you and your parents and other parts of the family who might be affected by what's going on. And the reason I'm suggesting that is that you need to talk to a professional about how you can process this, how to deal with it, because you all need some help for yourselves as well. Addiction can absolutely destroy a family, and I have seen it happen on more than one occasion. So best of luck to you. I hope I've helped a little bit. And if you've got follow-up questions, I'm happy to field them. And if you want to have a private conversation, you know who you are. You can just email me. Question number 3, why did you change the reading source from Hayes to Long? That's a good question. I changed it because I wanted to use a public domain source of the meditation so that others could access them without having to buy a book. Somebody, and I don't know if it's the person who asked this question or not, but somebody sent me an email once and said, hey, can you send me a link to all the texts because you used to put them in the show notes and you, for whatever reason, stopped doing that. And I said, sure, I'll do that right now. And then when I went to go find a link to the text, I'm like, oh, Hayes' work was done in 2002, which means it's still copyrighted work, which means it's not freely available online. And I thought, well, then I had better change something because I don't want people to have to buy Hayes' book in order to follow along. I hadn't thought of that. It was an oversight on my part. So I switched to George Long because George Long was published in the late 1800s, I think, very much in the public domain. Anything, I think, before 1921 is in the quote-unquote public domain. And so that is why you may have noticed, if you've been listening for a while, that the text I'm reading now sounds a little older, right? Hast thou and he shall and so on and so forth. That's the reason for that. But now the link in all the show notes will take you right to an online, free, no registration necessary text version of the meditations that you can follow along with or, move ahead with if you want to. Question number 4, how does one marry a love of being romantic with the concepts of Stoicism? I used to love being romantic and making grand gestures, but ever since practicing Stoicism, I've not been as interested. It seems to me that most of being romantic is dependency. You complete me. I am nothing without you. That sort of thing, which does not stand true when presented with concepts such as memento mori. Okay, so I'm going to start here by saying that you're right. Codependency is not particularly stoic or particularly healthy, but I think something has gone wrong with your thinking here, to whoever's asked this question. Romance is not codependency. Romance is an expression of care and attention. Paying care and attention to someone you love is actually outright suggested by the Stoics. And if you need a further explanation of this, you can check out episode 1, which is entitled Coffee Mugs and Death or something like that. It's got coffee mug in the title. We Stoics use memento mori in order to recognize the temporal nature of ourselves. We use premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of evils, to recognize, in part, the temporal nature of others. We want to treat our significant others in a way that finds us not regretting that we didn't when they unexpectedly die. Romance is certainly a way of living that value. And I would even go as far as to say Stoicism requires us to be romantic and loving. And I don't think I have to go very far to say that. Like I said, the meditations talk about this. We've talked about this on this show. So I would suggest maybe going into the back catalog and re-listening or starting from the beginning if you're a new listener. Question number 5. I'm a practicing Catholic, and as I learn more about Stoicism, I am interested in your view of how you organize, perhaps rationalize, and operationalize both the rigor of Catholicism, or any religion and its practices, and the integration of Stoicism within day-to-day life. So if you're listening to these episodes in order and on the day that they're released, tomorrow's episode features a conversation with Emma Varvaloucas, who's going to talk about exactly this towards the end of the episode. So be sure to listen to that episode. I don't necessarily think that Stoicism, with a capital S, is compatible with Catholicism with a capital C. I think if you're a very rigorously practiced Catholic, you cannot also be a very rigorously practiced Stoic, because the most rigorous form of Stoicism has a counter cosmology to Catholicism. Now, I am not a theologian. Maybe a very smart theologian could find a way to marry these two things, but there is a quasi-religious aspect, certainly a spirituality aspect to Stoicism when we talk about the Stoic God, which I've mentioned only in very brief passing. With the sole exception of Epictetus, the Stoics did not believe in a personal or involved God. So to become a rigorous practitioner of Stoicism, you'd have to abandon the belief that there's a God like the Catholic God. So you wouldn't pray, for example, and you wouldn't go to confessional, right? Those things wouldn't make sense if you were a Stoic, at least not in the way they're conceptualized by Catholicism or Christianity or any other modern religion. I'm going to go ahead and assume you're not looking to abandon your present faith in favor of Stoicism, although if you are, thumbs up, I'm all about that. You can, however, implement a practical version of Stoicism in your life by doing some of the things I suggest on this show. Reminding yourself of your own death, right? Memento mori, reminding yourself of the temporal nature of things and the mortality of others by imagining losing them and adjusting your behavior to respect that fact. That's premeditatio malorum. And by agreeing that it is important to develop a virtuous character based on the 4 cardinal virtues of bravery, wisdom, justice, and temperance, or if you prefer, moderation. You're not going to be a hard-line, capital S, Stoic. If you just adopt some things, you just pick and choose, but you will be implementing practical aspects of capital S Stoicism in your life. And since you already have a life philosophy rooted in your religion, my guess is that's probably going to be enough for you. And it's also okay. There's no shame in doing that. You don't have to be 100% something to get something useful out of that something. Question number 6, I struggle a lot with being envious of other people. Do you have any tips on how to be genuinely happy for others, even if your mind feels that they don't deserve it? Right off the bat, no. I don't have a way for you, and Stoicism doesn't have a way for you to feel happy for others while feeling they don't deserve their happiness. There is something fundamentally oppositional here because you're essentially asking, how do I be genuinely happy for others while not being genuinely happy for them? The first step here is to recognize that whether or not you're envious of someone, or happy for someone, you're not impacting that person. If you're envious, that's eating you up inside. It's not bothering them, it's bothering you. If you're happy for them, on the other hand, they're still not impacted by that, but you are, because you'd be feeling joy instead of envy when you thought about their success. You can't feel joy for your friend's success while being envious of your friend's success. That's not compatible. You'd only be faking the happiness, and you would know that. So first, realize that your actions here only affect you. That's step 1. Step 2 is to ask yourself why you're envious. If the answer is because they don't deserve it, ask yourself why they don't deserve it. If your answer is because I don't think they've worked hard enough to deserve it, ask yourself why you think that. And if your answer is because I think XYZ, ask yourself, do I know that XYZ is true? There is a good chance you don't think this person deserves their success because at some point you've ascended to a false impression of them, like they haven't, in private, worked hard or suffered, and you have a 360-degree, 24/7 omniscient understanding of their struggle or their efforts. So step 2 is to realize that you don't know what they do and do not deserve because you don't know all the facts. And even if you did know all the facts, it's not your place to determine what others deserve. Remember, fortune and misfortune do not discriminate. They happen to good people and bad people in equal measure, and you can do nothing about it. Karma does not exist in Stoicism. And then lastly, explore this question. Is part of why I'm envious here that I feel like I deserve the good fortune more than this other person, and I'm mad that they have good fortune and I don't? Then reread Book 2, Meditation 1. And this last question is less of a question and more of an expression of anxiety, but I want to see if I can still help. The idea of dying and there being nothing forever is a terrifying idea for me. I understand that I will not be conscious, so I shouldn't fear it, but I think that's what scares me, because if I'm not conscious and I have no perception of reality, then it would appear that nothing exists, and nothing existing forever is something that is a scary thought for me. So I don't think that what you're saying here is that once you're dead, you'll continue to be scared. I think you understand that once you're dead, you're not capable of feeling or thinking anything, so all your problems are over, and even if they weren't, you wouldn't be able to think about them because you'd be dead. I think what you're saying is that the idea of making that transition is the scary thing, the apprehension of having to make it. But why does this scare you? You go to bed every night, right? And it's true that every night You might die in your sleep and not wake the next morning, right? But you don't fear falling asleep. And as I've said before, and as I think Seneca has also said, though it may have not been exactly this, isn't the feeling of falling asleep and the feeling of dying kind of similar? Or maybe you fear a violent death. That's reasonable to an extent, I think. We just did an episode on this, I want to say like a week ago. But you have no control over whether your death will be painful or not. And yet here you are spending a lot of time worrying about it. Do you worry about other things you have no control over? Do you worry it's going to rain tomorrow? Do you worry you won't win the lottery next week? Do you worry that a sinkhole might open under your house at any moment, maybe right now, and swallow your home with you in it? All of those things are things that could happen, but you don't worry about them because you know that worrying about things you can't do anything about is a silly thing to do, right? It's not a big step to apply this same thing to your own thoughts about death. You can do nothing to prevent the death that you will experience in the end, but you can control how you live your life, how you serve others, and how you make yourself better. So try this. Whenever you find yourself worried about death, say, I'm going to die, but probably not the way I think or at the time I think. I can't control any of those things. But here are 2 things I can control today. Let me focus on these 2 things. And whatever 2 things you pick, that's up to you. But try to focus on 2 things every day that you can control and work towards those. In the same way that if someone said, hey, a sinkhole might open under your house tonight, you'd say, yeah, that's great. I can't do anything about that. I'm going to focus on meditating before bed and making a journal entry about how my day went, because those are things I can control. And I think if you do this enough, you might find yourself more and more focusing on the things you can control and less on the things you cannot control. And that is it. I hope these answers were useful. And remember, please, if you'd like to submit questions for next month's AMA, you can use the link in the show notes of any episode, including this one, to do just that. All questions are submitted anonymously, and I want you to feel comfortable asking whatever you'd like. No outro music today, just a classic Fade to Black. Take care.